The first thing I saw that morning was not damage, not a warning, and not a mistake. It was my family barn with someone else's approval stamped across it. I stood there looking at the words, HOA approved, painted across the wooden wall of my barn, trying to understand how someone could make a decision on my property without ever speaking to me. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and my family ranch has been in my care for years. The barn was never just a building. It was part of the land my family worked hard to maintain, a place that represented responsibility, history, and ownership. But overnight, the HOA had decided it needed their permission. At first, I thought there had to be some explanation. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had the wrong address. I wanted facts before making any assumptions. I checked the security cameras around the ranch and found something unexpected. A small HOA work crew had arrived late the previous evening. They were not there to repair anything. They were there because someone believed they had the authority to change the appearance of my property. The next morning, I contacted Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. She answered confidently and explained that the barn was visible from a community road, so the HOA wanted it to match neighborhood standards. She told me the approval marking was simply part of maintaining a consistent appearance. I asked her one simple question. Where is the document showing that the HOA has permission to make changes to my barn? There was a pause before she responded. Karen explained that the HOA had records showing the area was connected to community guidelines. But she did not provide an ownership document. She did not provide a signed agreement. She only mentioned internal HOA paperwork. That was the first detail that caught my attention. An HOA rule and a property ownership document are not the same thing. Instead of arguing with her, I started looking through my own records. I found my property deed, old surveys, and county documents that showed the boundaries of my ranch. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The barn was completely inside my private property line. But then I discovered something that made the situation more complicated. The HOA had a map that showed a different boundary. Their map placed my barn in an area they called community managed space. The problem was, I had never seen that map before. I had never approved any change. And according to the county records, there was no official update to the property boundary. Someone had created a version of the land map that told a very different story. I knew this was no longer just about paint on a barn. It was about who had the right to decide what happened on land they did not own. Before I could take the next step, I received an email from the HOA announcing a community property inspection in 3 days. They planned to review the area publicly, and Karen seemed certain they would prove their position. But I had one question they did not expect. Who changed the map, and why did nobody tell me? The next morning, I stopped looking at the painted words on my barn and started looking at the documents behind them. I knew the easiest mistake would be reacting emotionally, but I also knew that emotions would not prove ownership. Records would. I opened every file I had connected to the ranch, including the original property deed, county survey maps, and previous land assessments. Each document told the same story. The barn had always been part of my private property. But the HOA map was still a mystery. How did a neighborhood organization create a boundary that did not match official county records? I decided to find out before the inspection day arrived. My first step was contacting the county records office. I explained that I had 2 different maps showing 2 different versions of my property. The clerk reviewed the information and confirmed something important. The county had never approved a boundary change involving my ranch. That meant the HOA map was not an official property document. It was only an internal drawing. That single detail changed everything. The HOA was not managing a community area. They were making decisions based on their own interpretation of a map that had no legal authority. But I still wanted to understand why Karen Whitmore believed she was right. I scheduled a conversation with her and brought copies of the county records. Karen arrived confident and prepared. She explained that the HOA had been using the same map for years and that several residents believed the area around my barn was connected to the community. I asked her a simple question. Who approved this map? She looked through her paperwork but could not find a signed approval from the county or from any previous property owner. Instead, she showed me meeting notes from past HOA discussions. Those notes mentioned future plans for improving visible areas near neighborhood roads. They mentioned landscaping, appearance standards, and community projects. But they never mentioned ownership. That was the difference Karen did not want to acknowledge. The HOA could create guidelines for its own spaces, but it could not transform private property into community property through a meeting discussion. As I reviewed the notes, I noticed another detail hidden in the records. The map showing my barn inside the HOA area was not created recently. It was dated almost 10 years earlier. Someone had been using this incorrect information long before Karen became president. That raised a new question. Was Karen the person who created the problem, or was she simply continuing a mistake that started years ago? I decided to look deeper. I searched through archived county files and old property records. After several hours, I found a reference to a previous HOA board member who had questioned the same boundary years ago. The name appeared only once, but it was enough to open a new path. Someone in the past had already noticed the problem. Someone had already asked questions. And somehow, the issue disappeared without being corrected. With the HOA inspection only 2 days away, I knew I needed that missing piece of information. Because if someone inside the HOA knew the truth before Karen acted, this was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was a decision built on information someone chose to ignore. The inspection was only 2 days away, and I knew the next step would decide everything. I had enough information to show that the HOA map was not an official property record, but I still needed to understand how that map became accepted inside the community for so many years. If I wanted the truth, I needed to find the person who first noticed the mistake. I searched through old HOA meeting notes, archived emails, and public records connected to the neighborhood. Most of the documents were simple discussions about landscaping, road improvements, and community appearance. But buried in a collection of older files, I found a reference that immediately caught my attention. A former HOA board member named Robert Hayes had questioned the exact same boundary issue nearly a decade earlier. The note was brief, but the message was clear. Robert had written that the barn and surrounding land were privately owned and should not be included in HOA planning documents without written permission. That discovery changed how I viewed the entire situation. Karen Whitmore was not the person who created the confusion. She had inherited a mistake that someone else had allowed to continue. But that raised another important question. If Robert knew the boundary was wrong, why was the incorrect map still being used today? I contacted Robert and asked if he would meet with me before the HOA inspection. At first, he seemed hesitant. He explained that he had left the board years earlier and believed the issue had already been resolved. When I showed him the photo of my barn with the HOA approval marking, his reaction changed. He admitted that he never approved any plan involving my property. He told me that during his time on the board, some members wanted to make the neighborhood look more connected by including visible areas near private properties in community plans. Robert had warned them that appearance did not change ownership. But after he left the board, he did not know what happened next. Before leaving our meeting, Robert gave me a copy of an old survey document he had saved from those discussions. The survey showed the original property line clearly. My barn was not near the community boundary. It was fully inside my ranch. The document confirmed what I already suspected, but it also revealed something new. Attached to the survey was an unsigned proposal for a future community improvement project. The proposal included ideas for using areas near private properties to create a more uniform neighborhood appearance. It was never approved, but someone had kept using information from that proposal as if it were official. With the HOA inspection approaching, I now understood the bigger picture. The painted words on my barn were only the visible result of a much older misunderstanding. Someone had created a plan, someone had passed along incomplete information, and now Karen was defending a decision built on a foundation that was never legal. I returned to the ranch with the documents in my hands. The next morning, the HOA inspection team would arrive, and Karen believed she would finally prove her authority. But I was no longer walking into that meeting with questions. I was walking in with the one document that could change everything. The day of the HOA inspection arrived faster than I expected. I stood beside my barn with the old survey document, the county records, and the archived notes from Robert Hayes. For the first time since I discovered the painted approval mark, I felt prepared. I was not there to argue. I was there to show the facts. A few minutes later, Karen Whitmore arrived with several HOA board members. They walked toward the barn with confidence, carrying folders and paperwork of their own. Karen looked at the painted words on the wall and explained that the inspection was meant to confirm that the property followed community standards. I asked her one question. "Before we begin, can you show everyone the document that gives the HOA authority over this barn?" She opened her folder and presented the same internal map I had already seen. The board members looked at it as if it was enough. But when I placed the county survey beside it, the difference was obvious. The two maps showed completely different boundaries. One was an official property record. The other was an HOA planning document. Karen explained that the HOA had relied on the map for years and believed it represented the community area. I asked if anyone had ever verified that information with the county. Nobody answered immediately. That silence revealed more than any argument could have. The inspection continued, but the conversation changed. The board members were no longer focused on the appearance of my barn. They were focused on how a private property line became part of HOA planning without approval. Then I showed them Robert's old survey copy. The document included handwritten notes from years earlier explaining that the barn was privately owned and should not be included in community projects. Several board members looked surprised because they had never seen that information before. Karen became quieter as she reviewed the papers. She admitted that she had only followed the records provided by previous board members. She believed those records were accurate because they had existed for so long. But the problem was that nobody had checked whether they were correct. At that moment, another board member revealed something unexpected. She said the HOA had recently discussed expanding visible community standards along private roads because they wanted the neighborhood to look more organized. That explained why the barn became a target. It was not about the barn itself. It was about a larger idea that some people believed would improve the community. But good intentions did not create ownership rights. The inspection ended without the victory Karen expected. The HOA could not prove that they had authority over my property. Instead, they agreed to review the documents with the county. Before leaving, Karen looked at the painted words on the barn and admitted that the situation was more complicated than she realized. But as everyone prepared to leave, one board member stopped me and mentioned something important. She had found an old email from a previous HOA discussion that had never been included in the official records. The email showed that someone had warned the board about this exact boundary issue years earlier. The question was no longer just who made the mistake. The question was who chose to ignore the warning. The old email became the most important piece of evidence I had found so far. After the HOA inspection ended, I returned to my ranch and reviewed the message several times. It was not a rumor or a personal opinion. It was a written warning from a former board member who had questioned the same boundary issue years earlier. The email explained that the barn and surrounding land were private property, and that any community project involving the area would require direct approval from the owner. That warning had been sent before the current HOA leadership took over, but somehow it never became part of the official discussion. The next morning, I contacted the county office again and submitted the new information. The representative reviewing my case explained that this changed the situation because it showed the HOA had access to accurate information before making decisions about my property. Meanwhile, Karen Whitmore called me and asked to meet. This time, her tone was different. She was no longer trying to prove that the HOA was right. She wanted to understand how the mistake happened. We met at a local coffee shop, away from the tension of the property dispute. Karen explained that when she became HOA president, she inherited dozens of old files and assumed they had already been reviewed. The map showing my barn inside the HOA area was included in those files, and nobody had questioned it recently. She admitted that she made a mistake by trusting old information without verifying it. I appreciated that she finally acknowledged the problem, but there was still one important question. Why was the warning ignored in the first place? Later that day, the county provided another update. They had reviewed the history of the HOA records and found that the incorrect map was connected to an old neighborhood improvement proposal. The proposal was never approved, but several copies had circulated among board members over the years. Eventually, some people began treating the proposal like an official document. That discovery explained how the misunderstanding continued for so long. It was not caused by one single decision. It was created by years of people assuming that someone else had already confirmed the facts. But the biggest surprise came when the county found the original meeting notes from the year the proposal was created. One note mentioned that the plan could only move forward if property owners agreed in writing. That agreement never existed. The HOA had built an entire belief around a condition that was never completed. With this new information, the county scheduled a formal review meeting with the HOA board. Everyone involved would have a chance to present their documents and explain their position. Karen wanted the meeting to be fair, but she also knew the outcome could change how the community handled property issues in the future. Before the meeting, I walked back to my barn and looked at the painted words still covering the wall. They were no longer just a sign of a disagreement. They represented a much bigger lesson about assumptions, authority, and responsibility. I knew the truth was finally coming out. But when I opened the county file one more time, I noticed a name attached to the original proposal that I had never seen before. It was someone who had influenced the HOA decisions long before Karen became president. The name attached to the original proposal changed the entire direction of the investigation. Until that moment, I believed the problem came from outdated documents and years of misunderstanding. But now there was a person connected to the beginning of the plan, someone who had influence before Karen Whitmore ever became HOA president. I wanted to know who that person was and why their decisions continued to affect my property years later. The name was Daniel Foster, a former HOA planning committee member who had helped create several neighborhood improvement ideas. I searched through the county records and HOA archives for more information about him. What I found was surprising. Daniel was not a current board member, and he had not been involved with the HOA for years. But the documents showed that he was one of the first people to suggest making the neighborhood look more consistent by connecting visible areas near private properties with community plans. The idea sounded harmless at first. It focused on landscaping, appearance, and creating a unified look throughout the neighborhood. But the problem was that the plan slowly moved from improving shared spaces to influencing private property. The original documents clearly stated that property owners would need to approve any changes involving their land. That approval never happened. The plan stopped officially, but parts of it remained in HOA files. Over time, those unfinished ideas started being treated like established rules. I brought this information to Karen before the formal review meeting. She looked through the documents carefully and admitted that she had never seen the original proposal. She had only seen later copies that removed the warning about property owner approval. That detail explained why she believed the HOA had authority. She was working with incomplete information. But the county review meeting was not only about understanding the mistake. It was about correcting the record. On the day of the meeting, the HOA board, county representatives, and I gathered around a table filled with maps, emails, and historical documents. Karen presented the records she had relied on. Then I presented the county survey, Robert Hayes's notes, and the original proposal showing the missing approval requirement. The county representative reviewed each document carefully and explained the difference between community guidelines and private property rights. A neighborhood organization could create standards for areas it controlled, but it could not expand its authority simply because a property was visible from a public road. That statement changed the entire conversation. Several HOA members admitted they had never questioned the old information. They assumed previous leaders had already verified everything. The meeting revealed that the real problem was not one person. It was a chain of assumptions that continued for years. By the end of the review, the county recommended that the HOA remove the incorrect property information from its records and create a new process for verifying ownership before making decisions. Karen accepted the recommendation. But before everyone left, the county representative mentioned one final detail. The records showed that the original property boundary had never changed. The only thing that changed was the way people viewed it. And now, the HOA had to explain why it took so long for the truth to be recognized. The days after the county review meeting were different from everything that came before. For the first time, the discussion was no longer about whether the HOA had the right to control my barn. The question had changed. Now everyone wanted to know how a mistake could continue for so many years without anyone stopping it. The HOA board scheduled a community meeting to explain what happened and discuss the next steps. I attended because I wanted the residents to hear the facts directly. I was not interested in blaming people. I wanted the record corrected so the same problem would not happen again. When the meeting began, Karen Whitmore stood in front of the community and explained the situation. She admitted that the HOA had relied on outdated information and that the organization should have verified the property records before taking action. That statement surprised many residents because they had only heard the HOA's side of the story before. Several homeowners asked questions about the old map and why nobody had compared it with county records. The board members explained that the map had been passed down from previous leadership and was treated as accurate because it had existed for so long. But now they understood that history alone did not make a document correct. During the meeting, the county representative presented the official findings. The property boundary had never changed. The barn had always been part of my ranch. The HOA approval marking was based on an internal assumption, not legal authority. That simple explanation helped everyone understand what had happened. A community rule could guide community spaces, but it could not rewrite ownership records. After the presentation, several residents approached me privately. Some apologized because they had believed the HOA had permission to make the change. Others admitted they never questioned the information because they assumed the board had already done the research. Their reactions showed that the issue was bigger than one barn. It was about how easily incorrect information could become accepted when nobody checked the original source. Later that afternoon, Karen visited the ranch with a small group from the HOA board. She brought a plan to correct the records and remove the incorrect references from future documents. She also explained that the HOA would create a new review process requiring official property verification before making decisions that affected private land. I appreciated the effort because it showed that the situation was finally moving in the right direction. However, before she left, Karen mentioned something that caught my attention. While reviewing old files, the board discovered another document connected to the same property line issue. It was not a map or a meeting note. It was a private letter written years earlier by someone who had worked with the original neighborhood developers. The letter suggested that there was another reason the area near my barn had been included in old planning discussions. Karen did not know the full story, but the document raised a new question. If the HOA had always known the boundary was uncertain, why did they continue acting as if the answer was already settled? The private letter became the next piece of the puzzle, and it revealed that the barn dispute was connected to something much older than anyone expected. I received a copy of the document from Karen a few days after the community meeting. The letter was written more than a decade earlier by a consultant who had worked with the original neighborhood developers. At first glance, it looked like a simple planning note. But one section immediately caught my attention. It explained that the area near my ranch had been considered for future community improvements, but the plan could only move forward if nearby property owners gave written approval. That approval was never obtained. The idea was discussed, but it never became a legal agreement. Once again, the same pattern appeared. A possibility became a plan. A plan became a document. And eventually, people started treating that document like a rule. I reviewed the letter carefully and noticed another important detail. The consultant had specifically warned that private property boundaries needed to remain separate from community planning decisions. The warning had been clear from the beginning. The problem was that the warning was buried in old files and forgotten over time. Karen and the HOA board were not the only people who had misunderstood the situation. They were continuing a belief that had been passed from one group of leaders to another. But understanding the mistake did not remove the responsibility to correct it. The HOA began updating its records, but there was still one final issue. The painted approval mark on my barn remained. Karen offered to arrange for the HOA to cover the cost of removing it and restoring the original appearance of the building. I agreed because the goal was never to embarrass anyone. The goal was to restore the property to the condition it was in before someone made a decision without permission. While the restoration was being planned, I received another message from the county office. They had completed their review of all available records and found something unexpected. The original property survey from decades earlier included a note about the barn area that had never appeared on the HOA maps. The note confirmed that the barn was not only outside HOA control, but it also identified the exact reason the boundary had been protected for so long. The land was part of the original family ranch property, and had remained unchanged through every neighborhood development nearby. That discovery answered one question, but it created another. Why had the HOA planning documents continued to ignore the original survey when the information was available? The county suggested reviewing the history of the documents to understand how the mistake spread. I returned to the old files once again, expecting to find another simple explanation. Instead, I found a meeting record that changed the way I viewed the entire situation. The record showed that one person had questioned the boundary years ago and asked for clarification. The request was never answered. The question was never resolved. And now I finally knew where to look for the missing piece of the story. The missing piece of the story was finally found in an old meeting record that had been forgotten for years. The document showed that a former HOA board member had asked a simple question long before I ever discovered the painted mark on my barn. The question was about ownership. The question was about permission. And most importantly, the question was never answered. That unanswered question became the foundation of everything that followed. The record showed that some HOA members had known there was uncertainty around the property boundary, but instead of stopping the discussion until the facts were confirmed, they continued planning as if the issue would eventually solve itself. Over time, that uncertainty turned into a belief. The belief turned into an assumption. And the assumption eventually led to someone painting my barn with approval markings they had no authority to place. When the HOA reviewed the final documents, there was no longer any confusion. The county survey, the original property records, Robert Hayes's notes, and the old developer letter all confirmed the same truth. My barn was private property, and the HOA never had the right to control it. Karen Whitmore accepted the findings and agreed that the organization needed to change how it handled property-related decisions. She explained to the community that leadership was not about having the final word. It was about making sure decisions were based on accurate information. The HOA removed the incorrect references from its records and created a new process requiring official verification before discussing any property outside its control. A few weeks later, the painted approval mark was removed from my barn. The wood underneath looked different for a short time, but the meaning of the building remained the same. It was still part of my family ranch. It was still a place connected to years of work and memories. The conflict that started with a simple paint mark had revealed something much bigger. A document does not become true just because people repeat it. A rule does not create ownership. An authority only exists when it comes from the right source. Looking back, I could have responded with anger when I first saw the barn. I could have turned the situation into a personal fight. But that would not have solved anything. The truth was already there. It was hidden in surveys, records, and old documents waiting for someone to take the time to find it. Karen and the HOA made a mistake, but they also had the opportunity to correct it. The community learned that protecting neighborhoods requires more than rules. It requires responsibility and respect for boundaries. My barn never needed an HOA approval mark to prove its value. The records already proved what mattered. The land was mine. The history was mine. And the truth had been there all along.